Excellent. Good evening, everybody. We are here today for the Budget Subcommittee meeting. Reminder to everybody that this is being televised. Everybody should have an agenda. If we don't, we can pass them out. Does anybody need an agenda? Good. All right, so tonight we're going to try to crank through 8 items. Presentation that Connor will give on the summary report of our financial condition. It was given at the Board of Selectmen's meeting that just passed. Really a lot of information and good stuff. We'll also talk about the community comparison report, which is new info. So I think this is the first group to see that, which is excellent. We'll have discussion on a couple of topics: the 2020 budget forecast and calendar, the annual town meeting coming up, discussion around the presentation project the budget subcommittee would like to give regarding long-term considerations, jointly, potentially, to the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee. Lastly, approval of minutes. We'll talk about the next budget subcommittee meeting and reserve some time for public participation, if there is any at the time. So with that, Connor, do you want to start us off on the summary report?
Sure. So I will try to be more brief than I was last week. The selectmen not take up an hour of your time. So this is a report that some folks here might have seen before years ago. It's something that I am going to start doing each year during the budget process to try and provide a few different key documents with good information for the selectmen, finance committee, and school committee as we kick off the kind of public process for our annual operating and capital budgets each year. And so this is the first one of those reports. It's a summary report of financial condition. The intent of this report is to kind of summarize some key fiscal health metrics that are relevant for all of us in all of our different roles. This slide, Jack, do you want to, if you'd like, you can steal this seat. Okay. Slide is more for illustrative purposes than to go through the entire thing. It's just to kind of give a broad overview of the budget calendar. As you can see from the bright yellow arrow, we are actually just below that. We're at February 4th. We're still in the preliminary budget process. This is the first of 2 reports that will launch before the preliminary budget. So this is a summary report of financial condition. We're going to review the community comparison report tonight as well. I'll review that with the selectmen in a week. And the same night, February 11th, we'll deliver a preliminary operating budget for the town. As we all know, we'll go through a collaborative budget review process in the spring, February through the spring. We'll have some joint hearings with the Finance Committee to review departmental budgets. New this year, something Tom alluded to, is we're going to work together, and we're still going to work out exactly what that will look like, but work together on some sort of budget subcommittee presentation, a kind of state of the town, summary of a variety of important financial and strategic planning items for the selectmen's consideration. And all this takes place under the broader auspices of a budget process, which will lead to town meeting in May, where Dr. Cabral and I will do our annual budget presentation at town meeting for adoption. So the summary report of financial condition, which everyone here should have received a copy of in advance of this meeting. The purpose of this report is to basically just provide good information to folks who are in positions to make decisions about the town's finances about the most recently closed fiscal year. In this case, it's fiscal year 2018, which ended June 30th last year. And the data is publicly available information sourced from the Massachusetts Department of Revenue, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, and PERAC, which is the Public Employees Retirement Association Administration Commission, I believe. In order to kind of fulfill that purpose of providing key financial data to decision makers, we look at a variety of different data points. We look at the town's revenue and expenses, our taxation history, state aid, local receipts, reserves, debt, pension liability, and for the first time, this report this year includes analysis of OPEB, which is an acronym for Other Post-Employment Benefit Liability. So this analysis itself is informed by existing best practices that the town has adopted over years relating to our financial management. So before diving into the details of the fiscal 18 report itself, I think it's helpful to review the context of this report since its last issuance, which was in April of 2016, looking at the year-end fiscal 15, because a lot has happened relating to the town's finances since then. That last summary report of financial condition cautioned that the town must be careful to balance the operating and capital budget needs that we have with the dual imperative of maintaining financial discipline, and further that as balancing each successive budget since the recession has gotten more difficult, that the town must brace for the impact of stagnating revenues. Since that report, a lot of really major things happened. In spring of 2016, the Selectmen, Finance Committee, and School Committee all voted to recommend a $4.4 million operating override budget to town meeting, which town meeting did vote to adopt in May of 2016. In June, voters voted down the proposed override. Fall of that year, summer and fall, the Selectmen adopted financial management guidelines. The Selectmen awarded a contract for an operational audit of some of the town's management practices. In May 2017, town meeting adopted the fiscal 18 budget, which partially implemented those financial management guidelines, particularly as it pertains to the ongoing use of reserve funds in the town's budget to respond to a structural revenue deficit. In November of 2017, town meeting added $600,000 to the stabilization fund, which was in accordance with those policies. May of 18, town meeting adopted a budget which for the first time fully implemented those financial management guidelines. That budget reduced our reserve fund use to a 5-year low. In the concurrent fall town meeting, we added over $500,000 additional dollars to the stabilization fund, helping that fund reach the highest point that it's been in a decade. So starting to go through the various sections of this report, fiscal year 2018 free cash. The town has had persistent revenue challenges since the Great Recession, but despite that, we do generally have relatively healthy free cash generation, So we finished fiscal year 2018 in the black. Certified free cash balance was $2,089,000. This is a healthy amount, however, it is below the free cash generated in fiscal 16 and 17, which were just shy of $2.7 million and $2.4 million, respectively. Taxation and new growth. The town has and will continue to levy our taxes to the limit allowed by law. New growth has been a very important source of revenue for the town. New growth is the value of any new or improved property during the fiscal year. And in fiscal 18, it provided a boon to our revenue. We projected new growth coming in at about $700,000, and the actuals came in at over $1 million. At our last meeting last week, I believe Tom asked how much of that was attributable to any individual project, and I said that I thought that Avalon's new growth was spread over 2 years. I was incorrect. It was in fiscal 18, and it was in the area of 480,000, I believe. Some upper 400,000 of that number was one project.
Yep. That's what I believe in the email. So I believe that's a good number.
So that obviously was a significant driver of that new growth coming in over what our projection was. This growth brought the total tax levy in 18 to in excess of $54 million. And so the tables that you see above are both a 10-year look back at new growth each year, as well as what the tax levy was in those years. These tables, the last time this report came out, included another column, which you can still see the remnants of on the right, for any increases to the levy by override, but that is no longer applicable because there has not been one in more than 10 years, so that's not on the charts anymore. So you can see fiscal year 18 was great for new growth. It was the most that we've registered in that 10-year period. But again, a lot of that is attributable to one large project, so we have not readjusted our expectations of growth upward towards that amount. I think actually the budget in front of you projecting for 20 is assuming $700,000, which is more in line with the new growth that you see in 15, 16, 17, and where 18 would have been absent that project.
And I apologize, Connor, it's actually 418,000.
Oh, sorry, 418, thank you.
643 from Avalon.
So state aid, the table above illustrates a major contributor to the town's ongoing structural revenue deficit. The cuts to state aid that you could see between fiscal years 2009 and 12 were mitigated in large part due to an operational override that passed in Easton just before that recession in 2007. And that override thankfully built up the town's reserve position, particularly our stabilization fund, which the town drew upon heavily in the worst years of a recession to mitigate layoffs, but was not actually enough even with an override and the stabilization to stem layoffs entirely. So there were layoffs during those years, as private industry also experienced. So as painful as the cuts to state aid and then the very marginal growth to state aid after recession have been, the impact of the state aid cuts would have been pretty devastating to our operations had we not had that additional funding capacity locally. Something that you can see looking at the figures here, state aid peaked in, fiscal year 2008 at $11.96 million, so just shy of $12 million. It was cut successively with some minor increases in between those cuts to fiscal 12, which brought it to a valley of $11.25 million. And it took 8 years for state aid to recover to where it was in fiscal 8. So again, in fiscal 2008, state aid was almost $12 million to the town, and it took us until fiscal year 2016 just to get back to that point. So in the span of 8 years, we increased by 0.85%. Again, that's not adjusting for inflation. That's not adjusting for the real cost of providing services, anything like that. So it's a tremendous amount of lost ground. And just for illustrative purposes, if you look at the inflation rate in those years, had state aid kept pace with where it was, it would have been around $13.5 million in fiscal 16 rather than 12. So it's a really, really significant kind of lost opportunity from those years. Local receipts, as anyone who's sat through and endured any of my budget presentations will know, we usually point to local receipts as kind of a bright spot in our revenue picture. It is an area that has grown at a healthy pace in recent years. It's been supported by a variety of things. We've increased staffing of fire department and increased the provision of ambulance services, which drives a good amount of ambulance revenue. That's a local receipt. Building permit activity as the general economic recovery took hold, as well as some large projects and other things that are kind of incidental to broader economic trends. You know, when the economy is doing better, people buy more cars. When people are buying more cars, nicer cars, you get more excise taxes. So whenever you go out and buy a new car, you're doing your part for your town. However, we had always cautioned the good news in those budget messages that we did anticipate that at some point, as interest rates are rising and other economic things are cooling off a little, that local receipts would follow suit, and fiscal year 18 looks to be the beginning of that. Our actuals for fiscal 18 actually came in slightly below what our projections were. And that's largely attributable to a large non-recurring amount of building permit revenue coming in at 17 related to the Avalon project. So as you can see, you have some years with double-digit growth on a percentage basis, some near double-digit growth. So it's really been a healthy growth category for us. It's our third largest source of revenue overall, so it's done well. But it does appear that we're heading towards that tightening and leveling off, and that will just kind of add to the already relatively significant revenue challenges that we're facing, particularly in light of the state aid situation. Use of free cash, another area where revenue, free cash we typically conceptualize, at least here, because of the way that we balance our budget as part of our reserves, but it's also a revenue source, and it's another revenue source that is drying up. This one is by our own volition. We have been deliberately cutting our use of free cash in the operating budget to try to prioritize building up our stabilization fund, which is a good thing. But it's still informative to look back at what our free cash generation in the past decade have been. So With the exception of 2009 up here, you can see relatively consistently generating in the area of 1.5 to 2.5 million in free cash. 2009, free cash got hit relatively hard because there was mid-year cuts to state aid. It peaked in 2016, has been decreasing since then. And we expect that trend will likely continue because over many successive budget cycles of tightening our belt and narrowing down the margins in which we could try to find areas to save, that necessarily leads to tighter and tighter revenue projections, tighter and tighter expense projections, and when that happens, that eats into the generation of free cash. The town's reserve position. So again, this is based on year-end fiscal 2018, so we do know information that's important for context here, but based on close of year, June 30th, 2018, our reserve position, which is basically a metric if you look at certain expenses, what are the town's expenses to operate on an annual basis, and what do our reserves on hand constitute of that? Reserves being our free cash and our stabilization fund. We slipped slightly between 17 and 18 from 5.62% to 5.61% between those 2 years. That's a marginal decrease, nonetheless not the direction we want to see it go. There's a variety of things that influence this ratio. Of course, there's what the total expenditures are, which do increase slightly every year, but there was also a large contributor to that was that free cash in fiscal year 18 was $400,000 fewer dollars than in 17. The good news is that this is progress, nonetheless, from the last time this report was done, which was looking at fiscal year 2015. At that time, the town's free cash and stabilization funds on hand equaled about 4.75%. So we've made some progress. Work still remains, and the town is aware of how important this is, and so we've been prioritizing building our reserves. We've added 1.1 million to the stabilization fund in fiscal 18 and 19, which have brought the stabilization fund up to its highest point in a decade after this fall town meeting's action. And we've cut the reserve fund use in the budget itself to a 5-year low in fiscal 19, and also used no stabilization funds in that budget. Long-term financial considerations are always something that we have to keep in mind. We budget year to year, but we still need to be cognizant of longer-term liabilities that are on the horizon. On the next page, you're going to see some metrics for debt per capita, which show that Easton's governmental debt per capita is actually relatively modest when compared to our peers. Nothing particularly alarming in that regard. We maintain a healthy debt service budget and a solid bond rating from our investment agency of AA3. It's a strong bond rating. They've specifically cited conservative financial management as well as best policy adoption as things that are in our favor as a community and a government organization. Pensions. Our pensions in Easton for employees are managed by Bristol County Retirement. We're as part of a county retirement system. We don't have a town pension. That has a funded ratio of 67.7%. It's on track to be fully funded by 2028, which seems like it's far away, but it's not actually. It's going to be the 2020s next year, which is bizarre. And that's actually a bit ahead of many of our peers. And that is good news. In the interim, however, what that means for the town is that our pension assessments each year from the retirement system are pretty aggressive. So employees, depending on dates of hire, pay a certain amount of their wages into this pension system. Newer employees pay a larger percentage of their wages between, typically you see 9% plus a 2% contribution, which is good. However, in many years past, those contribution rates were lower, and the pension system, which is required to reach full funding, issues assessments to communities to fill that delta, and it's significant in Easton. If you look at our employee benefits line item, we're looking at 4.4 million for fiscal 20, and the actual in fiscal 15 was 3,090,000. So it's significant, and the reason why that's growing is because they're making sure they're looking, their bean counters are looking very closely each year to make sure that enough money is coming in both from wages or employee contributions, but also or employer contributions to make sure they hit that target of full funding. In theory, after full funding is hit, that assessment goes away, which would be wonderful. So check with me in 2028 for the good news. So here's a couple more comparative tables. We have the debt per capita compared to some of our comparable communities. These are our economically comparable communities according to the operational audit, as well as our contiguous neighbors. And you can see that our per capita debt is just under $1,600 per person. Neighboring communities range from generally in that area up to as high as $4,800 per person. Then you have a selection of retirement systems from our peers and people in the neighborhood. And you can again see the kind of funded ratio differential between where Bristol County is, which is quite good. It's second only to the city of Taunton, which is nearing 80%. And we're looking at full funding by 2028. Other folks are in the neighborhood of the 2030s. So,
Connor, what's that 1598 comprised of largely that we are on a per capita spend in terms of debt? Is that comprised of? Is that a ClearGov item? Like I know I can dial in on debt on ClearGov, but is the largest part of that the debt exclusion overrides type aspect?
It's all the debt.
It is.
all of it.
It's all of it. And so, that's probably why you see in some communities the debt is much higher.
They might have had a
it's
recent
total
debt exclusion.
So, it could be enterprise fund debt, it could be debt exclusion, it could be Community Preservation Act debt. So it's all the debt for the town.
But do we have a large, like is the 80% of it for us, is that like overrides related to past school building projects? Or is that a small piece of the 1598?
So I think your question is of the town's outstanding debt,
Correct.
how much of that is related to school projects in the past versus just general debt for normal?
Just general debt, right, and or other things. There might be other things, but so I use the school because I know that we've had those just as a member of the town. But is that the majority of it, or is the 1598, is that a small piece, and that really represents other things like the $500,000 we borrow to do the roads and the accumulation of all those things? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is basically like your outstanding debt.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, like if you want to look at the excludable debt piece of it, you're probably looking at about 25%.
So a majority of that debt per capita is just general debt that is standard business,
Yes,
right?
but
Standard borrowing.
standard borrowing, yeah, we've got an enterprise fund, and we do have CPA debt in there also.
And PA debt is?
CPA, sorry.
CPA,
For
yes.
the Community Preservation Act.
Okay, thanks.
So the thing about those though is that they just don't have that impact on your general fund operating budget because they have another funding source.
Understood. Thank you.
So other post-employment benefits, OPEB refers to the future estimated financial liability for the town's share of retiree health insurance premiums, including for folks who are working and not retired today. It is an actuarial figure that is important for us to get our arms around, but it's a very large number, and so that's why I felt it was important to put the context that the town has and will continue to meet its retiree health insurance obligations every year. We fund it each year in every successive operating budget. However, as insurance rates go up, people retire and then are replaced by new employees who then take their own insurance plan. Retiree health care is a growing cost, a fixed cost, that necessarily erodes available funds for other things like program improvements, staff, capital investments, things like that. So it's important to be thinking about investing for future liabilities in this area because they're only going to grow. The most recent actuarial analysis quantifies our OPEB liability at $118 million, which is obviously a large number, but it's larger than our annual operating budget. And the town took the first small step towards planning for this. In 2013, we established a trust fund and have been putting what available funds we do have in there. When we have an ongoing structural revenue deficit that's a challenging proposition to have available funds. So right now we have 113,000 in that account. So Easton's not alone in this. Funding OPEB is a colossal, multi-billion-dollar challenge for state and local government, and additional effort is needed to keep working on it. Thankfully, this year, one of the things that the town has done, working with our labor unions, is we've taken the first step towards a sustainable contribution to that OPEB trust. By thus far, the 5 ratified collective bargaining agreements that we have in town for this 3-year period include a policy framework for an employee wage contribution to that trust fund once all other unions agree to do so. So I want to be completely transparent, but that does not mean that there is money going into it right now. There is not. Everyone would need to agree to it, but it's a goal that we're going to work towards. And the reason why it has that kind of me too, everyone needs to do it, is because if you have a bargaining unit of 8 people contributing to a trust and the other 700 plus in town don't, that's not necessarily equitable. But it's an important first step, establishing that framework to build in something so that maybe 3, 6, 9 years down the road, you have meaningful and recurring contributions to this trust fund to hedge against future liabilities. So it's not something that is very common, but it's something that our unions deserve credit for coming to the table and working with us on. So we're working on it. So to kind of summarize this report, the town faces a variety of challenges in our mission to preserve quality services for the town and schools. We have rising fixed costs. We have long-term financial liabilities that require significant planning to address. We are deliberately and purposefully reducing our own reserve fund use in our budget, which is a good thing in one sense. It certainly makes our bond rating agency happy. It's a good practice to do it, and it allows us the ability to build up our stabilization fund. However, there's a cost to that, and it's effectively we're tightening our belt and reducing our own use of that, which is offset by having to spend fewer dollars in the operating budget. We have unfunded state and federal mandates that grow every year. They typically do not go away. State aid has been stagnant and is growing marginally. The governor's budget for fiscal 20 we'll talk about tonight a little bit, but we're looking at just over a 1% increase. I believe Chapter 70 is still looking at less than 1%. Unrestricted general government aid is 2.7, which, while appreciated, is the lowest it's been in years. So the challenge is still there. So not to end the kind of presentation on doom and gloom, while we do have a lot of challenges facing the town, they certainly haven't been standing unopposed. We've been working really hard to take action and address them rather than just be on the receiving end of them. And so we've worked with the schools. We've adopted municipal health insurance reform, joined the GIC years ago. That has borne out advantageously thus far. We've seen an average premium increase of just about 1% in the 4 years that we've been in there. That's, for insurance increases, pretty good. We've reorganized municipal departments like Health and Community Services to do more with fewer dollars. We've rebuilt our stabilization fund to the strongest point that it's been in a decade. We cut our free cash use in the budget to a 5-year low. We've captured millions in grant funding for things like SAFER to get 4 firefighters for the price of 1. We've established a policy framework that I just alluded to with some of our employee groups so that we can have sustainable contributions to our other post-employment benefit trust fund. We've preserved our bond rating and adopted best practices. We've cut employee wage growth and adopted wage scales that increase at slower rates that are more sustainable based on the town's limited revenue. And we've, of course, worked to reform our zoning and invest in infrastructure, particularly sewer, to try to spur economic growth and keep one of those critical areas of revenue, which is new growth, healthy. So there's certainly a lot of financial challenges. We're working hard to address them, and I hope that this report is informative and helpful for that process. So.
Anybody have any questions or thoughts of what the report said, or Connor's points?
I think it's very well done, Connor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Wendy. I'm sure that you were part of it.
All right, I had a couple points that I just wanted to bring
Give
up.
Michael,
Or,
that's,
I think that might be the,
that one's right
oh,
there.
Mike. Do we have a mic?
so a couple quick questions, I guess, points of clarification. One is we used the 2016 long-term debt and the 2015 population. Is that just because in terms of the frequency of the updated information
I think that
Yes.
was just the most recent information available.
that we had?
Yeah, we pulled that from the Mass Taxpayers Bulletin, but the last time that we used it, I think it was issued in January, but there wasn't a new one out. If you went to the website, I think the one that's up there is the most recent still.
Got it. Is there a timetable for when we think that might get updated?
The population?
No, so the long-term debt outstanding is 2016.
I don't know when that will be updated.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
We-
We'd have,
It's largely, this report is driven largely by our budget cycle, and we pull the most current information we can get in order to get this to you
Got it.
folks now.
Yep.
But we can check back. But at a worst-case scenario, the more current information year over year will be available in the successive years of this report.
Right. The next question I had is, I think what I was trying to get at, Wendy, on the ClearGov, is that you can select the debt tab, and sorry, I can't show everybody, but it shows you the per capita debt and what's driving it. Is that a fair representation to answer the question? So in other words, of the 1598 per capita, what is that being allocated in the town of Easton? And this gives me buckets that says, of that, $795 being allocated towards school buildings, and $180 being allocated towards sewer, $74 towards equipment, $62 towards water, so on and so forth. Is that a fair, am I talking apples to apples?
I believe that what you're going to see on ClearGov is probably a breakdown of the actual debt service payment, so the amount that we pay each year, whereas I believe the per capita debt in the report is based on debt outstanding.
Okay. Is there some type of proxy or relationship where there's a connection between the two? In other words, my spend usually per year represents,
It's hard.
Might not be.
You borrow
Yeah, now
for
that I
different
think about it.
lengths, so
Yeah.
you've got mixed, like maturities in there, so
Yeah.
it's
Good
not
point.
a,
I guess what I'm trying to balance is trying to understand, so first of all, this has nothing to do with the school debt. That just happens to be the one that comes up the most, and that, quite frankly, can often be the most valuable type of debt, given the projects that we've been able to participate in, like the MSBA. So this isn't about that at all. It's just a recognition that our debt happens to be lower than several of our peers, and that some of the categories, when I looked at ClearGov, for example, municipal buildings, we spend $14 per capita per year. We happen to be 96% lower than similar towns. So as one of the things for us to consider, and I know things can fall in different buckets, and there's a lot of, I guess, nuance and exploration we have to do, but as we think about things, and debt is one of them, and capital expenses will be one of those long-term needs, we should, I think, just consider a slide, and we'll talk about it later on for a presentation, that says chances are we may have an opportunity for some more debt because of the center school planning project, i.e. the early elementary school project. That is
Very good.
That is a very valuable debt to us, given the fact that we have an opportunity with the state to have a majority of that, a material amount of that project subsidized. And that would help us potentially alleviate a dramatic amount of capital repairs and maintenance that we need to do. So I guess I would just keep debt as one of those levers and/or considerations that we as a committee have to keep in mind, because we may need to lever it in order to address some of our capital needs, like municipal buildings and/or school projects that are coming down the pipe. So debt in and of itself is not a bad thing, especially when it can give you a really good return on its investment. That was just a thought. I was just trying to equate this 1598 versus this ClearGov.
Right.
Got it. I'll try hard, but I won't get there. I get it, Wendy. Some of the other things that I talked about, and again, I had the benefit of reading this in preparation for the Board of Selectmen, but From a financial analyst perspective, there are often times where you start to see patterns, and I think Connor alluded to them very well, in terms of our revenue structure. So for example, in most of our revenue structures, we have declined and/or there are one-time reasons for why they were higher in 2018 versus 2017. So for example, the new growth, if you backed out Avalon, it would have actually created new growth of 520 million, which would have been the lowest amount going back to 2013, 520,000, sorry. So that doesn't make it wrong, it just helps us put into mind the importance of these big projects.
Yes.
And potentially one of the things we should consider on a look forward, which is what we're trying to really think of in terms of revenues and expenses and potential needs. We have the Queesit Sewer District coming, we have 106 Sewer, so we should probably begin to think about as a team whether or not there becomes opportunities for material amounts of new growth development, like an Avalon project. I don't think I know of any that approach that size. But that's just one area where if you backed out a one-time item, new growth actually fell below 2017, 16, 15. And then to your point, Connor, about local receipts, you see that we went from 8.47 million down to 8.1 million, and that's just north of where we were in 2016. So to me, that's a second indicator or perhaps of a leveling off, Connor, as I believe you said. And those are things like the economy, the macroeconomy plays a role, where interest rates go in terms of throttling the economy up or down. And free cash is, I'd say another indication that just says, listen, last year we threw off less than we had the 2 years before, which averaged 2.4 and 2.7 million. Last year in 2018, we threw off 2.089, just north of FY15. So from the sense that we always talk about we are revenue challenged or revenue constrained, sometimes I feel like I've heard that so much that it starts to blend in with the wallpaper. But the reality is that it is so important for us to consider that, understand it. And to me as an analyst, when I start to see 2 or 3 or 4 things start to speak about a leveling off, that seems to me we want to probably begin to be cautious about revenue expectations on a go-forward basis, absent other big projects. Again, none of which are on the books, and the development of which, especially 106, is probably years away from bearing some financial fruit in that perspective. So important to plant those seeds now, but you don't get the return on that necessarily in the same year that we begin that construction. So Queesit, I think, is important. I don't know if anybody else kind of thought about the revenue stream from that perspective and or had any thoughts about that. I think those were the biggest pieces that I had. I echo what Craig said. This is very well put together, and I think it starts to frame for us a little bit about the growth opportunity that we have in terms of revenues and those items. All right. Any more questions for Connor or Wendy? Awesome. Connor, thank you for presenting to the team. Second go around was briefer, by the way.
Good. I accomplished that goal.
To your goal.
I met my goal for the day.
Right?
So I will try to be brief with this next one. I don't have a PowerPoint for it. This report was sent out today. I don't expect that everyone has necessarily read through all 20 pages of it today. But I figure we all have it. I think everyone has a hard copy. Thank you, Mike. That we can kind of flip along through. So this is the second of these kind of companion reports that I will be doing every year as town administrator leading into the budget process. The first one, we looked at the summary report of financial condition. That looks a lot at kind of key revenue indicators as well as some other long-term indicators for the town's fiscal health and what some challenges might be. Another report that's, I think, a really illuminating process to go through is one that we used to do many years ago called the Community Comparison Report. And again, this is largely a similar vein. This is a kind of financial analysis. It's benchmarking. I should always have the good hedge and the caveat that I do not purport that this is perfect. That this is the only way to analyze numbers. There are, a million different ways that you can digest these, and there are other ways to look at it that can definitely be useful. But these are some relatively standard metrics for benchmarking spending, which is what this report largely looks at. It's a community comparison expenditure report. Looking at spending on a per capita basis to try to have as close to an apples-to-apples comparison as we can with some peer communities as well as our contiguous neighbors. And so if you flip through the report, the first couple of pages will kind of speak to the methodology utilized here. The long and short of it is that we use the same methodology as the operational audit. I felt that that gives some credence to it. Not that the methodology we have used before lacked that, but the operational audit came out in the same fiscal year as the data that we're looking at in this report. So unlike the summary report of financial condition where we had information from fiscal 18 from a DOR, the most recent spending data from a DOR available was fiscal 17. So these reports always lag a little bit behind the current year. Obviously, we can't talk about fiscal 19 expenditures because those actuals remain to be seen for everyone. And other towns take a little bit of time to close the books at year end. So it's not necessarily publicly available where everyone ended fiscal 18 at 6 months ago. So this is the most recent year of data available. Again, this is publicly available information we obtained from Massachusetts Department of Revenue, fiscal year 2017. We select a group of core communities, as the operational audit did, looking at a few different criteria to try and select folks that it makes some good sense to compare ourselves to. We look at the population of the town, the average single-family tax bill, the income per capita, and the equalized valuation per capita. The EQV is basically the value of property in the community. We narrow that down to folks who fall within 10% one way or another in any of those metrics. To keep it kind of close, we control for character, which is obviously a very qualitative thing of a community by weeding out anyone with more than 40,000 residents, fewer than 15,000, or anyone who has a population density more than double what we have, because that would just make it a little bit more difficult to compare. So the group of comparable communities that this leads you to and what the operational audit selected in their benchmarking report is Ashland, Canton, Chelmsford, Dedham, Foxborough, Mansfield, Marshfield, and Walpole. And we also look at our neighbors who are not included in those comps, which is Norton, Raynham, Sharon, Stoughton, and West Bridgewater. And we profess that our neighbors might not have much more in common with us than our border, but it's still, I think, makes this less of just a purely academic exercise of looking at spreadsheets, and you also are kind of looking at what folks in the neighborhood are doing. So the broad conclusions you could take away from this report, and we'll go through them kind of quickly. Easton's total spending, governmental spending per capita, is beneath the median and the mean per capita spending for core communities and neighboring communities. So our per capita spend is 4th out of 6 of the neighbor group, and it's last of 9 in our comp group. Our education per capita spending, and I know that another way that can be analyzed is per pupil, which is certainly, again, I'm not purporting that this is necessarily the best way to do it, but I wanted it to be using the same factor for the rest of the departments. And while our spending amongst our neighbors is 2nd on a per capita basis, we are 7th out of 9 compared to our comparable communities. In education, our general government spending, that's town hall functions, ranks 2nd to last amongst our neighbors and is last in our core community group, with our general government spending approximately 42% fewer dollars per capita than our average peer. Our police department ranks 2nd to last amongst our neighbors and last amongst our peers in per capita spending. Our fire department per capita expenditures rank 6th of the 9 core communities and last amongst our neighbors. It is worth noting that fiscal 17 was right before we did get the SAFER grant, so thankfully that grant does help us move in a positive direction. Department. Public works spending per capita, Easton ranks 7 of 9 amongst our core communities. It ranks last compared to our neighbors. And interestingly, looking at, Tom, you were talking about trends that you see from an analytical perspective. When you look at the last time that a community comp report was done, the last year end we looked at, which was fiscal 14, the disparity between Easton's per capita spending and total spending compared to our peer group identified by the audit is actually growing and has grown since then. just kind of flipping through reports, some more kind of interesting data points that come out. Compared to our core group of similar communities, our per capita expenditures frequently hover at or below the 25th percentile. Our population is within 1% of the average population of our peer group, but our total budget is 13.25% lesser or fewer dollars than our average peer. And our per capita total spending is 12.7% less than what is average amongst our peers. That has grown, as I just mentioned. Back in fiscal 14, those figures were 11%, so our total budget was 11% fewer dollars compared to our peers in fiscal 14, and our per capita spending was 9% less in 14. So that went from 11 and 9 to 13 and a quarter and 12.7. So if you break into these departments, education per capita is $1,667. It's 7th of 9. We fare better in that regard if you only look at our neighbors, 2nd out of 6. But it's worth noting that even with that slightly better ranking, when you look at that group in its totality, we're still below the 50th percentile in that combined group. Again, for illustrative purposes, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of translate this to, well, what does this mean for our budgets and what we're doing with our spending? If Easton were to spend at the average rate of our core group on a per capita basis for education, we would need to add $1.9 million to the school budget. Our general government spending is the lowest total, so not looking at an equalized kind of per capita basis, our total spending in general government is the lowest amongst our comps. We're last in per capita spending amongst that group, $102.56 per capita, which is 42% below the core group average. And I should have opened with this, and you've done the right thing and just cut right to the tables. There are tables that are much easier to follow along in the back of this report. In order, again, for illustrative purposes, if Easton were to spend on general government services what we do, what our peers do on a per capita basis, we would need to add $1.77 million to our general government budget, which our general government budget is quite small. It's less than $2.5 million, so we'd have to increase that by 73%. Obviously, we're not doing that anytime soon, but it just kind of shows that disparity. As with the overall spending and the kind of disparity over time, the last time this report was done, that figure was 1.2 million to kind of catch up. Now it's 1.77. Police per capita spending, 172.24, ranks last of the 9 communities. It's 17% below the core group average. Noting the police department did add 2 positions after this budget. This is fiscal 17, so 2 additional positions were added in fiscal 18. That would help that inch up slightly. This position has declined from rank 7 of 11 core communities in fiscal 14 to 9 of 9 in fiscal 17. If we were to spend at our core group, we would need to add $693,000 to the police department. Fire per capita is $156.74, ranks last amongst our neighbors, 6 out of 9. Of our core communities, 11 out of all 14 collectively. Our per capita spending in this area is 12% below that of our peers. If we were to spend at a rate of our core group, we'd need to add approximately $500,000 to the fire budget. And as I said earlier, it's worth noting that since this year end, fiscal 17, we did go on to receive the SAFER grant to provide for 4 firefighters, which is obviously moving that department in the right direction. Public Works is $135.58 per capita. That's 7th out of our 9 core communities, 5th out of 6 of our neighbors. Spending in this area is 27% below our peer group average. If we were to fund Public Works at the same per capita basis as our peers, we need to add $1.2 million to that budget. Another area that is not an expenditure, but is still worth looking at, I guess in both reports, because we talk about it so much, our reserve position, it's worth looking at reserves in this kind of same frame. So when you look at combined free cash and stabilization fund balances, when we talk about that in Easton, we compartmentalize stabilization funds to be operating funds. We have a general stabilization fund. So when we, in the budget process, give our stabilization fund balance, that's the general stabilization fund. We do have other stabilization funds. We have a sewer stabilization fund. We have a capital stabilization fund. Those dollar amounts are included in the Department of Revenue's accounting of your cash on hand. So you will see a stabilization fund balance in this data from DOR that is higher than what we report for general stabilization funds. We do not typically include that in our local analysis of our reserve position because although town meeting could, with a 2/3 vote, take money from sewer stabilization and put it in an operating account, we would recommend against that because those dollars are intended for specific capital uses. And we also we want to make sure we're being transparent, communicating to budgetary stakeholders that while those dollars are there, that their intent's really not operational. So we don't usually include that.
To a degree, it could be considered doing that would cut against the financial policies and practices that we've put in place and have been recognized for via good bond ratings,
Right.
and so on and so forth.
Well, and there'd be
Never do things like that, but
right, and there would, yeah, I mean, as a,
transparency is important.
for sure, and again, it's something town meeting could elect to do. There would be negative externalities to that decision on other portions of a budget, the capital budget, the sewer budget for sewer projects. So,
Yep.
So anyway, that was an overly long-winded way of saying that the numbers in here are in the reserve position will show a higher stabilization number than what we typically show because it includes special stabilization accounts as well.
Got it?
We rank second, even with that, rank second from last amongst our neighbors. We fare slightly better compared to our peers, ranking third from last. We're well aware of how challenged our reserve position is, and that's why, as I just kind of touched on in the other presentation, the town has been pretty aggressively pursuing building our stabilization fund and adding over $1 million to it in the past couple of years. So the conclusion of this report is that I think it's definitely reflective of the town's continuing efforts to achieve and maintain service delivery with some really, really lean budgets and conservative spending levels. Since the cuts to state aid and a recession and the decade-plus long structural revenue deficit, the town has been, to borrow a term from the schools, had more of a reactive position in budgeting. We figure out there's something good to be said for living within your means, but we are basically doing revenue-based budgeting. We see what the total available funding will likely be, and we try to find a way to live within it. We find ways to get creative in the margins. We, move healthcare plans. We engage in net, generating lots of net meter credits, reforming wage growth, things like that. And those are all really important things that deserve doing absent a structural revenue deficit. But as time goes on, the wiggle room for creativity within margins necessarily gets smaller and smaller and smaller each year. So you have one report that's kind of highlighting some of the revenue challenges we have. You have this concurrent report demonstrating the lean budgets that we have. And so I think there's some broad conclusions that are worth articulating that you could take away from this report. Our budgets are extremely lean where they are now. We know that, this is looking at fiscal 17, we know that nothing significantly has changed in that area. We have not dramatically grown any of our departments since then. And so it's important to know that improving services is pretty unlikely with our current revenue levels. Our overall spending, both on a total basis and on a per capita basis, is far outpaced by our peer communities, whose average budgets are in excess of $100 million, and their per capita spending is $4,239, despite being within 1% of a community size of population. Relatively speaking, there's less disparity in spending on education, fire, and public works compared to our core group. Wendy and I actually spent a decent amount of time trying to figure out what was the best way to word that. because we didn't want to be misleading, we want to say that these are the best funded comparatively, because they're not the best funded comparatively. There is slightly less disparity in those groups.
But still disparity.
But still disparity. So even with these departments that have smaller disparities than some of the most disparity-laden departments, they're below the 50th percentile, and they still lag behind our peers meaningfully. General government remains our leanest budget. This is not surprising, given what we know about the town's operations, and not just what we know, but you could look at the audit's findings, looking at our staff levels. We have very lean staff departments. Obviously, I'll bias frame of reference, which is my own in my department. We have gone from 3 to 4 full-time staff for management, procurement, and human resources of the town. Our comparable peers average back in fiscal 16, so perhaps it's grown, but in 16 they averaged between 4.5 and 6 full-time staff for comparable functions. And that's a pattern you see in many departments in town. So it's not surprising to see those budgets be lean, because an overwhelming amount of our spending is on our human resources, because those are the folks who deliver services. Our reserve position remains challenged. It will continue to be so as long as we are relying on reserves, in part to close that decade-long structural revenue deficit. And to wrap it up, the last community comparison report cautioned that the trends present in the 3 first community comparison reports, so fiscal 12, 13, and 14, of tight expenditure budgets and increasing reliance on reserve accounts, were to continue in fiscal 15 and 16. The good news is that since then we have cut our reserve use, which peaked at over $2 million in fiscal year 2016. We've brought that down by about $800,000. A lot of people deserve a lot of acknowledgement for that. That's one of those things that's certainly not a glorified part of town budgeting or school budgeting, but it's incredibly important to try to be as lean as we can on those and to keep moving in that direction. And they don't come without cost. So the schools of the town and the Selectmen Finance Committee, everyone involved deserves a lot of credit for that. So that's good news that we've reduced our reliance. However, the cost for that is clear. And one thing that I think speaks truth to that is that you're actually seeing now a growing disparity between our spending in a total and a controlled per capita sense compared to that of our peers, or who we would compare ourselves to. So it's good that we're reducing the reserve use, but there's a real cost, and that cost is that there was a disparity. That disparity is growing, and that those disparities in spending do eventually translate into service delivery. So again, not trying to be doom and gloom, just present the facts. So
I think that's important. Yeah, to me, the facts have no connotation in terms of negative and positive. It's helping us understand the foundation that we're trying to make a decision on and a recommendation on a go-forward basis. So any thoughts? Anybody had a chance to digest and or wanted to point some things out?
Do we have any outcome-based metrics? I'm trying to tease out for myself a better understanding of how does spending growth, spending changes, how do those predict any outcomes?
So you're talking about using either qualitative, quantitative, both?
Both.
So we don't have any kind of formalized outcome measure. You can look at spending as an output, right? But that's different than an outcome. So we, in certain departments, do have those outcomes looked at. So one that we've made example of is health and community services. Fiscal 19, we're spending fewer dollars, right? So the input is actually going down, but the program offerings have increased. So that would be program offerings could be considered an outcome.
Exactly.
Transition of veterans from Chapter 115 benefits to either other benefits or employment is another positive outcome. So we have seen some positive outcomes despite challenges on the input side, but no, we don't have like a comprehensive outcome analytics process
and
happening.
Certainly those would be extremely tricky.
It would be awesome to do. I would like geek out on that for days. I just think that, I'll be honest, I don't, to do that comprehensively, I don't think we have the resources. But it's something that's worth looking at.
And my motivation in asking is to gain a better understanding of what can we predict as we work to maintain level service budgets.
Sure.
What can we predict? Because the reality is we're doing more with less is not a strategy.
It's a reaction.
And if we have some measure, something that we've seen somewhere else that says, as your growth in expenditures slows, as this or that happens, the expected outcomes should be this. I think it makes communicating and understanding the numbers much more powerful.
Sure.
Because as you said, Tom, it's the facts don't lie. But of course, we're looking at it's just a spending number. So
Sure.
Sorry.
No, I think that's a good point.
I think, again, this is certainly not a scientific analysis, but one area that you can look at, and we talk about this as far as outcomes, is that when you end up with tightening margins, you look at, I guess, a policy way to look at it would be a service alteration, right? That's kind of a PR speak for, I think, about like the schools having to outsource special education band services, right? So that is a service, right? So those are the kinds of outcomes where you would try to, the first cut is to preserve the service, and then the next cut is to try to preserve the service in-house as it exists today. The next cut would be to attempt to preserve a service with perhaps outsourcing. And there's some virtues to outsourcing, and there's some downsides to outsourcing. There's something to be said for in-house permanent staff, I think. And then you whittle to potentially you end up where certain services just stop. There was a time that long precedes me, but when the town was in a tight revenue spot, I believe the town hall had to close one day a week because we didn't have the staff to adequately deal with foot traffic and do their jobs. And so that's a service reduction. It's and it was understandably a very aggravating one to the public because if the staff would actually be here, the doors were just locked so they could catch up on the stuff that they did when they were under-resourced other days of the week. But understandably, if you come to town hall and you have a tax bill you want to pay in your hand and you could see someone through the window and they're not opening the door, that's obviously a very frustrating kind of service adjustment. So those are the areas where you do end up, which we try to avoid at all costs. But I do think that your point's well taken, and it's worth considering. What are some tangible things that are likely? It's challenging too because you don't want to put out. Numbers are numbers, right?
Right.
You run a risk, I think, of if you put out. These are the things that could change. Of people saying that you're putting out kind of scary. This is what we won't have budgeting, right? Which is, of course, I think if you deliver it appropriately, you can have that conversation thoughtfully and hopefully not have it be taken that way without kind of ringing alarm bells. I think another thing we saw during the budget process, forgive me, I can't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, all just blurs at this point, but where we were working very, very hard with the schools trying to figure out what we were going to do to try to preserve a school resource officer program in a shared capacity, which we all collectively would like to see a full-time dedicated officer at each of the regional and the Oliver Ames High School, and kind of having that difficult, sometimes painful conversation about how are we going to deliver that service, and we end up finding a way to make do with a shared resource when we know that optimally we would expand and improve that service. So those are, again, that's not a scientific analysis, but those are just some kind of observation on the ground analysis of where these things can lead.
And you always want to be tricky that you don't descend into pointless navel gazing. And you can analyze these things for days, and I don't mean to drive it there. I appreciate the response.
Anybody else?
No, both reports are very helpful, very informative. Thank you for doing.
Just a couple points. One, I think Connor alluded to it, but I do want to highlight it. It's one thing to be revenue constrained, and then if you feel as if you have an abundance of resources on the expense side, then that revenue constraint is relative. But it seems to me that we have not only a revenue constraint, but we also run a relatively lean budget, which basically means that your margin of error and/or the size of an impact on any downturn economically that might happen can be outsized. So it's just a consideration, all right? It would be one thing to be revenue constrained, and if this report said we were in the top 1 or 2 spend, that may potentially say we could absorb some type of revenue challenge, perhaps a little bit better than other communities. Right. That's all relative. I will say, by and large, spending less doesn't make it wrong.
No,
and I
not
just
at
want
all.
to be upfront about that.
Absolutely.
It does, however, ask the question of what the opportunity cost is, and Mike, I think this is where you may have been going with it. What is the opportunity cost that may exist if we continuously underfund versus any benchmark, whether it's the core, whether it's the surrounding communities? And I think there's important learning in there that we can bring to our town as part of our presentation to the Board of Selectmen and to the Finance Committee when we have that opportunity to do so. For example, we may have found that we can run more efficiently, and I'm not saying that is true or not true, but that might explain some of how we are able to underspend comparatively. But in the sense of, let's assume getting back to the average is a fair estimate just to start, I believe I added that expense up to be $4.875 million. And that's the $1.9 million for the education budget, which, to Connor's point, there may be less disparity between the educational budget, but because it is such a large part and it has such a large volume of activity to it, the percentage variance might be smaller, but the dollars are still incredibly material to our town. 1.2 million in general government, police is 693. I'm sorry, 1.77 million for general government, 693 for police, 505 for fire, 1.2 million for public works. Those add up to $4.875 million. So that just makes me want to ask the question of what is our town potentially not investing in that will have consequences down the road. Those consequences could be the educational opportunities provided to our children. Those educational opportunities not just impact the children, but those families and perhaps people's desire to move to our town. And therefore, that might impact the overall housing value of all people in our town, not just those related to with a specific, I have my children in the school system and that's why I care type item. That's just, again, it's just one aspect or one way to look at it. You know, if we, from the public works perspective, from the fire and the police, do those get to safety issues? We do a tremendous amount. I think that we provide amazing services, not just from the school side to our parents and to our children, but from the town side. But are there things that over time, when we do this underfunding for years upon years, that to your point, are we, and I may say it in a different, maybe a backwards way, but is there an opportunity cost and or how can we find out what the value is of that investment? And I think that those two are just kind of two different ways to say the same thing. So that seems like it's not a little. That seems pretty material. And I, for one, just wonder what other towns are getting based upon their investment in their asset, their town, that they'll be getting for a return that we may not be getting. And that's not an advocate to spend the most. It's not an advocate to spend what we're spending. It's just a desire to have an understanding that says, if I am thinking of our money as an asset, am I investing it in the right, most prudent way to get the best return long term? And
Exactly. It's that observation that the goal is not to spend money. The goal is to achieve
Deliver services
the
and have
outcomes
a
that we want in our
town,
community.
Good education system and a good police department and all those
Yep.
things, which I do think we do our best now. But you're right, that is, and it's an important distinction. It's not just money. This stuff translates into the people who govern the town.
Exactly.
It's the collection of all those things. You know, there's the sign on the wall, the newspaper ad that says Easton makes top 100. And I remember the sense of pride that we were able to all demonstrate publicly for the nation to see. And I know we all believe in that without question this day. But I just wonder whether or not when I look at this, we're positioned to make that headline again. And if, I'm not saying that we should always strive to be the top 100 in the country, but I think we have a town that is the top 100 in the country. And I think it's important that we support it and understand from a financial standpoint what that may take in order to keep us in that conversation and or getting closer to it rather than working away from it. And I'm not saying we know that direction from this information, but I think it gives us some food for thought. And I think it certainly frames for us the importance of, at least from the school side, the school project and making sure we communicate to the town that opportunity. I would think that that would be an important piece of many pieces for the school side. So those were, I guess, just my takeaways I thought I had. I love the fact that you added in the amount of dollars it would take to get us back to the median. I think that makes it real, Connor, instead of the percents and the rankings. So I think that I applaud that without question. And then, you know, we can all see the grids, but I think this was a really impactful study. It might lead into your next.
So, thank you for the feedback. The next document that is part of a community comparison report, however, it's marked as draft because it's new, and I'll be honest, but I don't know exactly what the end intent of this document is. However, it is really valuable to look at what other communities are doing. This is how Foxborough in the past has analyzed some of these metrics. And we borrowed that and added some of our own. This is a really data-heavy sheet, but it's color-coded. You have the same core group, so you have the core communities that are similar to us for economic and demographic reasons, as well as our contiguous neighbors. And then you have a variety of different statistics. Again, these are just numbers. We're not necessarily trying to draw a particular conclusion from these, at least. If more analysis is needed. But I wanted to at least provide it to the budget subcommittee and let you folks kind of review it and see what your thoughts were. I think some interesting things do emerge here. So you have green as in the first quartile, so the bottom quarter of any individual metric. You have blue as second quartile, so in between 25 and 50%. Anything in black text is in the third quartile, 50 to 75, and then red is 75 to 100% as far as where these things would be distributed in a normal distribution. And so Easton is up at the top. We have our population, and we have the year all the way at the top. That is the most recent year available. So you have our population, where that ranks, per capita income, assessed value of property, our total parcels. I added something that I felt was helpful, and the data was in that community comparison report. Something why I think it's so valuable to look at what our expenditures actually are is because we have facts that are true that sometimes seem confusing. Easton is very revenue challenged, and we comparatively spend significantly less than our peers. However, our average tax bill is sometimes higher than our peers. So somebody could look at that and say, well, wait a minute, how do you square that? That doesn't make sense. And so I think this spreadsheet helps kind of analyze what are those differences in the communities, because even if we're demographically similar, even if we're within 10% one way or another on equalized value of property, there are still things within each community that are quite different. And one of them that sticks out, and this was something I added to, or we added to this report, was whether or not communities have a split tax rate has a huge driver on what the average single-family home tax bill is. And so if you look at columns J, K, L, and M, you have the residential tax rate of each community. Again, this is from 17. Ours has actually gone down.
We don't have columns on the top of our sheet? Is that right below the word draft?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That's right. I'm on a computer and you're
on
not.
a computer. I think it's just to the bottom left of your word
so
draft.
right to the left of draft, you'll see two separate kind of boxed in categories. You have 2017 RO tax rate, rank, and then CIP rate as additional percentage of RO rate. I can probably find a better way to word that, but so what those two things are trying to show is what is the residential tax rate per thousand in each of these communities. And you'll see Easton's at this time was 1622. It was ranked 5 out of 14, so it's in that third quartile. However, I thought it would be interesting to look at, okay, well, which of these communities actually have a tax rate split? And if they do, what is that kind of premium? So if there's a split rate for residential and commercial, what is the commercial tax rate in that town compared to, or in addition to the residential? And so you'll see a lot of communities there. So Easton is 0 because we don't have a split rate. And then you see all in blue, those zeros they don't have split rates. But then you see the ones in red, and those do. And so, for instance, Canton has a split rate. Canton's commercial rate is more than double what their residential tax rate is.
Right, so it would be 1279.
Right. And then so 105% of that on top of that. So really 205%.
Right, it'd be like $26.
That's right. Yep.
Something like that.
Dedham, their premium, that's my word, not the Department of Revenue's. I don't know if Dedham would be happy with that, but is 112%. So again, more than double. So really, I should have added a 1 in there. I'm sorry. So it's 212% of what that rate is. Stoughton, 78%, West Bridgewater, 61%. So I thought that was an interesting, again, not necessarily drawing anything from there, except the existence of a split tax rate has a significant impact on your tax levy, or a significant impact on where that levy comes from. And it does in these communities.
And the reason why I really like that ad, Connor, is because one of the things we're tasked with is not only developing a short and long-term forecast, it's also developing strategies to solve it. So we don't get to just articulate that we believe there is or isn't a problem. If there is a problem, we're tasked with developing a strategy to help understand the solve. And to me, I think this is one that could be critical, that says, listen, there's going to be, potentially, I could see this playing out. There's an intersection where down the road, we're going to need more revenues. Because we believe if we want to get closer to our peers, whatever that case may be, that we need more revenue. And to me, having or challenging our town to get to the point where we develop a commercial tax base that justifies having a split rate seems to be an indicator of revenue opportunity. And whether or not we can or can't get there, I'm not sure that's not for us to solve. But it is for us to say there's one strategy that we've found other towns have been successful at XYZ, if that makes sense. So I'm making notes of these things as we go through. I would encourage the rest of the team to do that, that says, listen, when we get to this, whatever we want to recommend, here's some of the strategies that might be, and this could be one of them. I don't think it's nothing new or earth-breaking. I think the way, though, that Connor has displayed it has made it impactful, and we can make that real for people to understand. This is one of the nuggets that communities are using to drive revenue growth that's pretty important, and maybe we should focus on that.
Looking on that point, Tom, because it's a great point. Looking at those that have the split rate, and I'm scanning the list, right? But those appear to have, to me, to be stronger industrial and commercial bases.
Mm-hmm.
They are.
I look at the ones that don't have a split rate, the zeros or the close to zeros, and they are more bedroom communities, as I would think of them. Again, I'm not sure that actually says anything other than just trying to segment the two groups.
Right.
Well, to a certain extent, that points out the goal of economic development, which they've already achieved, and we're trying to through our sewer districts.
That's my initial reaction to it. Yeah.
So if you unpack that, and maybe we can send a working file around this. We actually have all the spreadsheets. There's basically a spreadsheet for every one of these columns but you would never be able to read through all of it on one sheet. But when you look at the tax rate, so what you're seeing as not that I am purporting that that's legible and clean. I know it's a lot of numbers and data. With the exception of one, every community that has a split rate has at least 20% of their value is commercial. Easton is at 13%. I'm going to do a little bit more digging. Walpole is actually 13% as well, and they have a split rate, which it just sticks out. Every other group that has a split rate is at 20% or more of that value coming from commercial property. And just to see the impact of that, if you look at so Dedham, obviously they have Legacy Place, that's just not comparable. But in Dedham, 81% of the property value in town is residential, but only 66% of the taxes are paid by residential property, right? That's a meaningful shift.
Right. Walpole surprises me because they have them all. They have Walpole surprises me because of they have the mall, and they have, if you drive along Route 1, you see all the commercial development there.
Right. So we'll dig into that a little and see. So there's certainly some interesting things. Some other things that stick out as interesting out of this whole group. Easton has the most the most square miles of land.
I saw that.
Yeah,
I don't know if
biggest.
I don't know if the DOR or if somewhere else, and we might be able to find it, of getting that metric of how much land is preserved space.
So I had a question to ask, how much is taxable, which is the
Right,
same thing.
because that's right. And so, and that's one of those things where, again, you can have a conversation about facts and not necessarily make a virtue statement. Easton has a tremendous amount of preserved space. That's part of why Easton's such a beautiful community. That's part of why people like it here. That's part of what drives property value here. However, preserved space is space that's not developed and therefore not taxable. I'm not saying that it ought not be that way, but that is obviously a unique characteristic to the town, one the town prides itself on. Another interesting fact is we're in the top quartile in road miles. So maintenance of roads is significantly expensive. It's something that is incredibly challenging. We talk about what are the outcomes we're missing. When we have lean budgets, we do not in our operating budget have recurring funding program for road maintenance. We have Chapter 90 funding from the state, and we've been borrowing $500,000 a year through our capital budget to supplement the level funded state roadway money, which has been level for many, 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 many years. And we've been borrowing $500,000 through our capital budget every year to supplement that kind of bread and butter DPW operation of paving roads. And we can't do that forever, because obviously you borrow $500,000, you don't pay it off the next year. We do pay it off, we pay our debts, we have a good debt service budget, but we can't just add $500,000 every single year. So Dave Field is going to be before the selectmen a week from tonight, giving his annual presentation of his 3-year pavement management plan, and that is going to demonstrate in the first year an assumption of another borrow, but in years 2 and 3 what it looks like without continuing to borrow $500,000 a year for that, because we cannot continue to do it every single year. Yep. And that's going to be meaningful. There are certain, and it will be meaningful, again, translating just from spending to a particular road, if this is the case, can't be done, right? And that's a real impact.
Agreed.
So having one of the higher amounts of road mileage to maintain is an interesting thing that sticks out there as well. This also includes a tally of what folks receive for net state aid.
I was going to ask about that.
Easton's actually above average in this group. So we're at 115% of the group average. That varies. We have a low, again, this isn't adjusted for community size, so you have a low of, you have some closer to 5 million, but those are towns with budgets that are smaller than ours, but nonetheless it's good data. And you have some that go as high as almost 20 million for net state aid. You have net state aid as a percentage of the operating budget. You have the history of general overrides since Prop 2.5 was enacted. I think that's interesting context. Some communities have sought overrides dozens of times. Easton, it appears, has sought 9 since 1988, with 6 failing. And the most recent one having passed in 2007, I believe. And you also have the value of those overrides that have contributed to the levy since then. Yeah, and that looks, I think you're seeing the 19. Yeah. It's, you have Sharon has added 11 million to their tax levy through overrides. So again, not necessarily making a value judgment, but just good comparative data to have.
Agreed. It might illustrate how others got to the point where they were able to spend more. And from
Well, and Wendy, can you speak to that a little bit? When Prop 2.5 went into effect, where we were had a large impact on where we all are today, right?
That can definitely make a difference, yes. Especially if you had excess levy capacity at the time.
Right. That's really good stuff. To me, the more pieces that help us compare ourselves against neighbors or core groups, it might help us understand questions we have to go ask to challenge the assumption and whether or not we do have an opportunity and or risk that we should articulate. That's a good lead-in, Connor, if you're done into the budget forecast and calendar and the annual town meeting.
Sure. So I promise, be much more brief on these next couple of items. You have a slightly revised budget forecast from the last one that you've seen. This one, I believe, just takes into account the fiscal year 2020 budget that has been filed by Governor Baker for the Commonwealth that has 2 impacts, one on revenue and one on expense. On the revenue side, we are looking at another tight year. We're looking at 1.32%, Chapter 70, which is our largest account of state aid for education, going up 0.71. You do see one large increase that is, at least on a percentage basis, that is the charter tuition reimbursement. I will get to that on the expense side that Wendy and I were just reviewing. But so you're looking at 1.32%. We're carrying a more modest assumption and on the local side for new growth of 700,000. Again, we kind of talked about that at length tonight, that more closely mirrors where we have been if you kind of subtract out some of those larger projects. We're projecting a very conservative 2% right now for local receipts, and that's projecting 2% off of a budget of 7.1 million, which is lower than what our actuals were. We do try to be conservative there. We don't want to be in a situation where we're not meeting our forecast. Other funding sources, you will see again modest 2.8% projected increase. That actually, oh, sorry,
No, that's
I'm
the
misreading.
overall total.
That's the overall total. We're projecting 2.82% of total revenue. We're looking at a decrease of 9% in other financing sources, and that's largely driven by another cut in free cash use to try to keep with that policy of using no more than 50% of available. So free cash in fiscal 18 was lower than 19. Necessarily, that means that its use in the next available budget, which is 20, is also lower. So that is another area where we're going to be tightening our belt. That's the goal for now. It's worth noting we're looking at a $1.25 million projected deficit now. That's likely that will increase by next week when I deliver the actual preliminary budget, because that preliminary budget will include actual departmental requests. This tool that we use, it is just a forecast, but the budget that I deliver next week will show a larger deficit that accounts for actual requests for departmental programming for fiscal 20.
Got it.
So, so meeting that goal of cutting reserve use again is very important, but it will be very challenging given all the other challenges that we are looking at.
Understood.
The expense side, for now, these are placeholders. This will be revised in a week. And with the exception of we're still waiting. We did get some preliminary news on health insurance, which is good, but we don't have the details yet. So we held a conservative assumption of a 5% increase across the board in insurance premiums. Again, we've actualized significantly less than that. We always start very conservatively this early in the process. We don't want to get too optimistic too soon. And we've heard that the aggregate rate increase going
Yes.
into next fiscal year for GIC plans is 3.3%,
3.3, yes.
but we don't know what the rates per plan are. And so we don't just take that and go to the bank with it. We actually get the rates per plan and analyze it for the actual subscribership of our hundreds of employees. So once we get those per plan breakdowns, we'll update that. But nonetheless, if it's 3 in that area, that is better news than what this forecast has.
Jackie, I heard preliminarily that there is a potential draft agreement regarding the union for the schools,
The teachers,
for the teachers
we're gonna vote on it in our meeting this week.
this week. Got it. So,
We still have some outstanding contracts that we're working on as well.
got it. So, but the timing is such it's starting to all come together, so to speak.
Yes.
Hopefully. Understood. Thank you. Any questions, folks, on the forecast? Additional points?
Or
Connor?
one other thing worth noting, so we do have those preliminary state aid numbers, and state aid numbers come with the revenue side, but also the assessment side. Wendy, I don't know if I actually have that in front of me. Do you? So the charter school tuition reimbursement on the revenue side, you'll see the last year was $4,000 and change. This year is projected in the Governor Baker's budget to be closer to $75,000. The corresponding assessments for charter schools,
You won't see that detail on this
The detail is not
forecast, you just
here.
have a total for the
the
assessments.
state assessments, okay. If you go to other expenditures on the last page of county and state assessments, you see a jump from $835,430 last year to $1.2 million this year, with a $360,000 delta that is attributable to the preliminary state's budget's assessment to Easton for charter school.
So we get 150, how much is it?
We get 74,000,
74,000, and it,
and the assessment is 300 and
377,139. That's what the latest estimate is in the governor's budget. That number and the revenue will probably change, with
Right.
each budget
as
revision.
this is revised through the House and Senate process, but it's something.
hopefully it will get better.
Yes, we're gonna well, we hope we're going to look more closely, because it is such a large disparity from last year.
And really, when they set last year's budget, I mean, you don't have the sheet in front of you, but in the final like cherry sheet or state aid numbers that came out, the charter school tuition amount was $75,215, and it went up to $377. To be honest, we knew $75,000 was going to be inaccurate. It was going to be more in the range of the $200,000 figure. But $377 is still a significant jump from where it realistically will end up this year.
So we'll need to keep a close eye on that.
Do we have any ability to influence that discussion? Obviously, I know we can reach out and voice our individual thoughts, but is there any $300,000, if I'm reading this correctly, right?
So that's something that we'll speak specifically about with our legislative delegation. To their credit, they do stay in contact with us throughout the budget cycle. They've reached out to many of us already and asked what priorities are. And when we have, as a community each year, done joint letters and kind of done like mini analyses to send to our delegation to kind of just highlight the challenges that we face, understanding that state has its own budget challenges and may have to balance their own budget, but highlighting the constraints that increasing state assessments and marginal state revenue increases cause for the town. So I've already reached out to them regarding that, and we'll continue to do so throughout this budget process.
Well written.
And the reimbursement is totally inadequate also on the revenue end.
Right.
Right, even if the total assessment is not that, you're looking at a reimbursement rate of what, a quarter to 1/3 of what you're being assessed.
Right.
So the net is a loss.
Right.
Right?
Completely. Annual town meeting, Connor?
Sure. Annual town meeting will be May 20th, 2019. The Board of Selectmen last week voted to open the warrant for annual town meeting. If anyone's committee has a warrant article that they are aware of, or even one they think might be coming down the pipeline for this town meeting, please let my office know by February 25th, so we can get a placeholder on there. So that was all just calendar. There you go.
Excellent.
Third Monday in May every year.
The discussion regarding the Budget Subcommittee Long-Term Financial Planning Presentation Project. So part of this, I think we saw at the beginning of Connor's presentation, was a timeline of when we may be able to get in front of the Board of Select People and or the Finance Committee, and whether or not we do that together. There may be some benefits to that if we, and I'll, Connor, if I could ask you to help us coordinate what might be best to be respectful of people's time and have the maximum impact to the process. It seems to me it would be ideal if we could get in on for perhaps 30 minutes with the Finance Committee and the Board of Select People, so that we could set the stage a bit perhaps with our findings before they launch into their 2 nights of joint meetings. That might be a great way to communicate with everyone and not have different separate meetings, but I'm amenable to whatever works.
Sure.
Being respectful of each body, whether it's the Finance Committee or the Board of Selectmen, but also having our goal of trying to make an impact and help them understand what we see as a long-term challenge or opportunities for the town.
So there's a couple of different options. One is to have that presentation from Budget Subcommittee the first night. We've been doing 2 nights of joint budget reviews that are formally the Selectmen and Finance Committee. The school committee usually comes to one of them for the school budget. So we could just get the whole town in a room.
Yep.
And on one of those first nights, everyone will be there and have that presentation as the first agenda item before certain departments, perhaps a more limited amount of departments, so we don't have a 4-hour meeting, get into some 2020 budget discussions. I think that's certainly doable. There's some efficiencies there with everyone's time, because most of the people are going to be there anyway. The only challenge that presents is for our time, which is those hearings usually happen towards the end of March, which is 7 weeks from now. It is certainly doable by then, but it also depends on what the Budget Subcommittee wants in this report. I think and intend for the 2 reports that we reviewed tonight to be part of that, because my understanding of kind of the idea here is a kind of strategic assessment of where the town is. And I think that these are some of the background work that needs to exist for that to be done. Something else that I think is absolutely worth being a part of that conversation, looking at outcomes, is talking about the town's position on capitals, capital funding, and our asset management. That's something I already talked to Dave Field about, including as part of Budget Subcommittee's project, perhaps some reporting on things like roadway funding, things like building needs. Again, not all of this is new information, but there's so many different reports out there that I think the idea here is to synthesize a lot of this information in a way that makes sense and is important. So things like pavement management plans, municipal building needs, can roll in some of the numbers that we've already started to get from the school planning committee and have kind of a report take shape that could have, the summary report of our financial condition, which is some health metrics. You have the expenditure report. we will find some way to work that very large spreadsheet in. I don't exactly know how yet. I welcome ideas from anyone here. As well as a discussion about asset management, what the opportunity costs will be, what the kind of outcome costs will be if we can, for these lean budgets, when it comes to things that are much more kind of quantifiable, like fleet management. Like, we know there's a certain line in the sand of capital investment we need to make every year in DPW's fleet if we want the average age of that fleet to remain the same or improve. We know there's a certain dollar amount we need to invest in our roads every year if we want the road condition to stay the same or improve. And we can demonstrate, based on our current available funding, are we going to meet that? And if not, where does that put us? So that can be part of it. All that is already pretty ambitious.
How much time do you think we would reasonably be able to ask of all of those important committees in that important night? 30 minutes?
You're the committees.
And I know, I'm asking.
I mean, I would think that would be the.
Right? An hour feels like way too much.
I think
And
that's too much.
15 minutes feels like I'm going to give you some bullet points and we're going to get in and get out. So that's kind of how I got to 30 minutes. Does that feel like the right amount of time for everybody to have I would expect us to probably have like a summarized deck of the key points that we want to make sure the audience walks away with, supported by an index of materials that references to the specific projects or points that we get to speak on. Does that make sense?
I think that's fine. I think that I'm already eliminated from being the person who speaks.
Yep, you're out.
I'm out.
Love to have you on.
Natural
for reference.
selection casualty here.
Yeah, self-selected. He's self-selected out.
Well played, sir.
That is you want to talk about strategic planning? Look at that.
Well done.
That maneuver.
Okay. If people have a strong interest in presenting, I would absolutely welcome people to volunteer to step up. It feels like perhaps hearing the timing, I feel like we've gotten a lot of information in terms of the town services side and some of those items that we can all work with. I could work with Connor to come up with a framework of slides that we think, here are the 5 slides we could talk about related to this information that we have. And for our next meeting, could we prepare, kind of like we did tonight for our town side, some detail from the school side that might frame those 5 slides, so to speak, of what, and it might be proactive, reactive, and strategic. It would be, here are the key things, kind of like I wrote down some of the things you did, like we might want to have a slide on revenues, we might want to have a slide on debt, on capital, on, I think you could probably call it asset management, is probably a good way to say it, on expense levels. We might be able to come up with a framework that says, from this information, what are the pieces that we want to talk about? We could bring it back for our next meeting to say, what does the committee feel like in terms of the draft that we've put together? And then learn about the school side on March 4th. And then we would have to have an interim meeting between March 4th and the end of March to look at the draft slides from what we packaged from the school learnings, and then hopefully at that one bless the town slides, and then perhaps work to bless the school slides. And I use those 2 pieces just to, it feels like those are the 2 largest portions of our spend. So
Marilyn had said that we should have more numbers by then. We're still waiting for some principals to get back to us, and they need to put together the information. But
and part of the thought process that we'll need to have, and I think that you and your team are on the school committee and the schools themselves and Dr. Cabral is so uniquely positioned to talk about, is what does that future hold? I can't speak to the fact that this report says we are underspending by 1.9 million. Might be perfectly fine.
yeah.
It might not be. That might have consequences that begin to bear on us in a few years. And if they do, those are the things that we would need you folks to help us understand and help the town understand when we articulate it.
There are missed opportunities, missed courses that
Right.
other districts are offering their students that maybe we can't, and
Exactly.
nursing shortages, that kind of thing.
Yep. And there's some things that I've learned that from you and so many people on those that focus on the school is that we are at a risk in some cases of not meeting the programmatic requirements, for example. And I wouldn't think over time those programmatic requirements will get easier.
There are motions in the state legislature to change some of the course requirements, and we may not be prepared for that. And
yeah,
there are a lot of moving parts.
yeah.
Right
So
now.
to me, those are just some risks that say where. I think of having been on the early elementary school project, and I think a lot of us are familiar with it. I think of the fact that those 3 buildings literally don't have certain spaces to accommodate the physical needs and requirements of certain programs without us taking up teacher lounges or making space or I think using some type of large closets in cases. And when more, I'm sorry.
No, and rearranging classrooms. I mean, we've been cited on all of those areas. So there's very real consequences, loss of funding, imposition of fines.
Yeah. So those are the things that if you looked at a multi-year environment, I don't think those challenges get easier if we keep those same facilities in that specific example of those 3 schools. And you should think about that in all of our pieces. If the DPW kind of has a great point. I mean, we could choose not to take the $500,000 out, but that might, and I'm not saying it will, but that might cost us far more than $500,000 5 years down the road if we continuously year after year underfund in such a large amount of mileage that we have. I'm not saying it will, but those are just the considerations that we're trying to help the town understand, not to raise alarms, exactly to your point, but just to try to be diligent in our responsibility to help them understand the future, whether or not there's opportunity or risk. Does that feel like a potential plan? We'll come up with some slides between now and our next meeting of what we think it might be.
Is that the form we want this to take?
Slides?
Yeah.
I would think. What are your thoughts? Like,
I'm flexible. We already have 2 kind of like mini white papers.
yep.
I would think DPW, Dave Field already presents a pavement management plan. That's its own document. His capital plan on fleet maintenance and building maintenance will speak to the other 2 kind of key things. Those are existing kind of policy documents, so we can just kind of pull from all of those.
Agreed.
And if you want, it can take the form of sort of, you have these discrete silos of analysis, and pull the school piece in as well. I don't know if DESE makes certain metrics available that might be good for comparison to like the average classroom size or things like that you could overlay on top of these.
Yeah, that kind of gets a little tricky because
Okay.
it doesn't take it's averaging regular ed and special ed classrooms, and but we can certainly look and see.
If there's some sort of decent metrics there that maybe can be appended into the community comparison, and just kind of go through some of those trends. And I'm not a huge buzzword guy, but you kind of summarize that as like a SWOT analysis of what some of our kind of internal strengths and weaknesses are, and what some kind of environmental opportunities and challenges we're facing are, based on that.
Agreed. I like
And
that.
that can be kind of some slides that I'm not allowed to speak during because I'll take everyone's night up.
Right. Doesn't mean you get to write them lengthy either. It's
I
a
try.
full package.
I'll try.
No, I think that's
Four words per bullet.
excellent. Is that a
My New
is that
Year's
a
resolution.
fair approach? Should we schedule a meeting after March 4th in between so that we can meet again? I know it might mean we meet more than our once a month, but it feels like we're going to have a little bit of a pinch regarding timing if we want to
will.
maximize this opportunity to speak to everybody. Is that fair if we try to maybe schedule March 11th? And I say that without...
With the Board of Selectmen meeting.
I'll just need to check with Dr. Cabral in Maryland, see if they're available.
Understood. How about if we, maybe it's not a Monday, we could always be a little bit more flexible on that.
I mean, it can be the Monday that there's a selectmen's meeting. It just would need to be earlier. Couldn't be at 6.
6, that's, yeah.
Right.
So that is an option. You can do the 18th.
When's the Board of Selectmen meeting in March? The 11th?
We have the 11th and the 25th.
11th and 25th?
So we have not coordinated with the Finance Committee when we want those departmental reviews to be. Historically, they're typically in late March. So the 25th and 27th might be those dates, but that still is up in the air. But I think that it might make sense.
The 18th works.
Yeah, we can do the 4th of March. We'll kind of bring back some refined stuff, get some school information, and that gives us 2 weeks to kind of, we have that meeting. It'll need to be a working meeting of looking through it and thinking what do we want to draw from it and what are the salient points, and that gives kind of 2 weeks for us to
Package it up and then,
put a bow on it.
does that sound good for everybody?
Yeah, I'll check with Dr. Cabal's assistant.
Awesome.
Make sure she's-
Great. This next meeting is super important. If there's any prep that we can help as a team for it, let us know. If you got questions, thoughts, anything, feel free to reach out.
Is there anything else outside of, not that I'm asking for a bigger project, but anything else outside of kind of the comparative analyses we've looked at, and rolling in some kind of asset management and educational aspects that anyone here is particularly concerned with that they think are worth noting?
Capital one comes back big for me, just in terms of helping people understand that and adding that in. And I think you already spoke to that. The operational audit that we did, that was predicated on 2016 data.
That's correct.
Your update,
It's fiscal 17 data
17?
for spending and fiscal 18 for revenue metrics.
when does and it's a similar process and approach, I believe. Is that a fair statement? The operational audit and the approach that we did to update our community
Yes,
comparison
the
report?
operational audit, the consultant who came in and did the audit actually used our internal benchmarking as a metric and said that's actually quite good. I'm
Yep.
willing to use that.
Good.
So it's the same methodology.
At what point, and I'm not looking to do this, but at what point does the last operational audit become not relevant anymore? It will always be the last one that we had. I'm grateful, first of all, for the team putting together 2017, because to me, at least that gives us that next step to say, fundamentally, this or hasn't changed. So I think that's very important. And I know that not much has changed since 2017's and 2018's numbers.
So it's a good question. I think the audit committee chair is actually going to do a presentation on the operational audit at the selectmen's meeting on the 11th. There will
Excellent.
always be trends in it that are relevant. By our nature, government doesn't change super dramatically over the course of 1 or 2 years. So some of the things noted in there, there was a lot. It's a good tool of aggregated information. Certain things that we know to be true. For instance, we're very lean staffed, but some union, comparatively, we do have employees that, depending on the department, are compensated better than market, right? So we have fewer people, but we pay more competitively, and I think that's part of why we're able to deliver good services in spite of having few people. There was other things in there. I think that it might have touched on. It might have touched on sped van services, but I think that's something that's been implemented.
It talked about all kinds of transportation services.
Sure.
Fees.
And the school committee's made a lot of, and was before that, making some program changes there. So there was some staffing recommendations that were implemented since then. So a lot of it has been done. Much like if you get a management letter during the annual financial audit, there are some aspects that the town may not implement. The IT section comes to mind. There was some just difference of professional opinion between our IT departments and the consultant on things like server redundancy, which is fine. So I don't think it's a question of it not being relevant, but it becomes, the data becomes older and older. And however, the stuff that it looked at is things that a lot of which is, it dug down into a much more micro level on some areas, like individual salary basis. But the community comparison report, in my opinion, captures a lot of that kind of in the big picture.
Got it.
And that's something we can kind of do year over year. So.
Should we add a reactive, proactive, strategic angle to the slides that we're presenting? I think that was one of the more impactful items that the schools did last year.
As far as when we're talking about what we're doing,
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all I have. Absent anything else, has everybody had a chance to review the meeting minutes from November 26th? If there are no comments or questions, I'd take a motion to accept the Budget Subcommittee minutes dated Monday, November 26th, 2018.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Setting of the next Budget Subcommittee meeting, we have one scheduled already on the books for March 4th, Monday, 6 p.m. We're going to explore setting a second one up March 18th at 6 p.m. as well. Jackie, if you want to shoot Connor and I a message on that, that would be great. Public participation,
I scared them.
not seeing any. And unless there's any other questions, thoughts, comments, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Wayne, thank you.